Hey there folks, it's Blue here at Blue Bears Games, and for today's video, I decided to show you my own personal Grand Arbiter Augustin the 4th build that is part of my 32 deck challenge. For those of you that don't know, I actually did a budget build video on Grand Arbiter back in July of 2022 for a customer that had a budget of $150. I liked the build so much that I had to make one for myself. It just so happened that I needed an Azorius colored deck for my 32 deck challenge anyway, so it worked out very well. My version, however, is not so budget friendly. In fact, mine happens to be about 10 times the cost of the budget build I did, and a big part of that is because of the land base. Now, if you don't know what Grand Arbiter does, let me tell you real quick. Grand Arbiter is 1 white, 1 blue, and 2 generic mana for a 2/3 legendary human advisor with 3 abilities. The first two are similar and probably could have been combined in the same line of text, but it reduces the cost of your white and your blue spells by 1 generic mana. The third ability is similar, but kind of the exact opposite at the same time. It increases the cost of all of your opponent's spells by 1 generic mana. All of these abilities may seem simple and not very powerful at first glance, but there is a reason why it is included in my 5 commanders under $5 that will make your friends hate you video. The natural way to build this deck is a Stax/Pillow Fort style, and is one of the most hated archetypes among players of the game. So instead of talking about why it's hated, how about I just show you how I built my version, and you can see why for yourself. So if you've seen any of my other videos, you know I like to start the lands. The lands in this deck are pretty basic. It's going to be a lot of mana fixing and a couple of things that are utility. So we start with Command Tower. Eventually I will be able to get some special edition Command Towers, but for now it's just a basic one. A Tundra, because the OG dual lands are the best mana fixing cards in Magic, so I had one, so I'm going to put it in there. Hallowed Fountain. It's a shock land, it's almost as good as the OG dual land. Glacial Chasm, I like these, they're called check lands. They're really nice because they can come into play untapped for the most part. And with dual lands and shock lands, the actual OG dual lands and shock lands, they will come into play untapped for the most part. Sea of Clouds, it enters untapped if you have 2 or more opponents. So I'm trying to not have any lands come into play tapped. Adhikar Wastes, so it taps the Adhikarless and then it's a pain land, so it adds a white or a blue and deals a damage to you. Nimbus Maze, it comes into play untapped again, taps to add a colorless, and then it can tap to add a white if you control an island, or a blue if you control plains, and I'm sure I'll be able to get that accomplished. Henge Gate Pathway, it's white on the front side, and it taps to add a blue on the back side, so obviously it's a nice inclusion. I actually am starting to come around on these. The pathways are actually a pretty good way to fix mana, in my opinion. Flooded Strand, it is the true fetch land, and it is the one that goes and gets a plains or a island. Emeria, the Sky Ruin, it's the first utility land I have here. So it enters the battlefield tapped, and then at the beginning of my upkeep, if I control 7 or more planes, I may return target creature card from my graveyard to the battlefield, and it taps to add a white. So the thought process here is if for some reason there is a way for my opponents to actually kill one of my creatures that I need out, I can eventually, if I have 7 planes out, get one of them back or get all of them back over time. And this is heavier on white than it is on blue, so I shouldn't have a problem getting at least that many planes out. Soul Debbie Excavations is an interesting one because it's not very heavily used because it was only printed in 1 set. It is one of those weird lands that when it enters play, you have to sacrifice a land or you have to sacrifice it, but it does something cool. So it can tap to add a blue and a colorless, and it also has an ability that says you can basically scry one. So the way they worded it back then was you pay 1 tap and look at the top card of your library, and then you may put that card on the bottom. I believe it has been errated, but I can't be sure because I haven't looked at the actual errata of it. It probably just says 1 tap, scry 1. Reliquary Tower, because this is a slow burn kind of a deck, it's going to be a long game with this out, and I have a lot of ways to draw cards, so I wanted to be able to make it so that my hand size didn't have to go down to 7, and there are multiple ways to do that in here. This is the first one. Oops. Next is Strip Mine. If you've seen any of the videos that I've produced over the last 4 years, you know that one of my big things is that I like to put at least 1 land destruction card, specifically a land that does it, into my decks. I do it for the budget versions that I do, and I do it for my own decks because you just don't know what kind of land you're going to face. There are so many lands out there that can be devastating that you just have to be sure to be able to get at least rid of that one. And then the rest are just basic plains and islands. So I have a couple of the full art foil Zendikar Rising plains, and then some basic ones after that are foil. And then I wanted to show you the islands that I have. These are from, I believe, 2001 Arena League. They're actually pretty cool. They are originally the Ice Age land. I wish that they were snow covered, but they're not. But they're pretty cool. They're actually quite old and rare. I got 2 of them in there because I think I only had 2. And then the rest are this island because I was actually a fan of this art, the little swirl. So, and I don't know how many of each I have in there off the top of my head, so I will have the deck list in the description of the video so you can see.
For the ramp section, it's pretty basic in the beginning, and then it goes into some cards that I've not really used a lot of before. One I have and I don't like, but I'll go over it. Start with the Soul Ring because why not? I mean, it's in almost every Commander deck. An Arcane Signet because it's a 2-color deck, and I finally think I have enough Arcane Signets to start putting them in my own decks that are 2 colors. My previous thought process before was I don't need it in 2-color decks, but it's just too good. It's a 2-drop, doesn't come into play tapped, and then it can add the colors you need, so I'm going to start adding them to my 2-color decks. Thought Vessel, it's another one of the cards that gives me no maximum hand size because I had to solve that problem of having too many cards, and it's a 2 to cast mana rock that at least taps to add colorless mana, so it's a pretty good choice. This is where things get a little interesting. So I added land tax to the deck. I haven't really been a fan of land tax lately, but I'm going to try it in this deck because it's 2 colors, so I'll be able to mana fix easier. It doesn't actually ramp you, it mana fixes because it goes and fetches lands and puts them into your hand, not into play. But during your upkeep, if an opponent controls more land than you may search your library for up to 3 basic lands and put them in your hand and then shuffle your library. And 3 is a good number. It's a lot of cards to come out that will thin your deck out. Again, I haven't been a fan of this, and one of the other cards I have in here that I have in this section I'm not a fan of either, and I'll go over that in a second. But I'm going to try it and see how it works. And if it has to come out, it will, and I have other options for ramp after this. Something new that I haven't tried yet is Archaeomancer's Map, and actually it will pair well with land tax, and I'll explain that too. So it's an artifact that when it enters the battlefield, you go and search your library for up to 2 basic planes, reveal them, and then shuffle. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player controls more lands than you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So what I'm hoping for here is that a lot of people play lands ramp, especially in green. Landfall decks are notorious for it. I'm going to be behind at some point. So my hope is that when I'm behind, I can catch up using Archaeomancer's Map. So we'll see. I'm going to check it out and see how it works. And then the last card in the ramp section for now, before any changes, is Smothering Tide. And this is the card I was talking about that I just don't like. A lot of people are high on this card. I'm very low on this card. I'm not really a big fan of it. It's a 4-cast enchantment that says whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2 generic mana. And if that player does not, you create a colorless treasure token that has, the tap and sack it to add a mana of any color. And the reason why I'm not a fan of this, I have tried this in multiple different decks, multiple different times, and it just doesn't ever really pan out for me. However, in this deck, because I'm doing mana denial, or I'm making everything cost more, it is a possibility that it may actually give me enough treasure tokens to be worth it. I will play, I will see, and I will find out. And if it doesn't pan out the way I hope, I will make the change, and in the update video, I will let you know. As far as the creatures go, I've chosen a slew of creatures that are Staxy, Pillow 40, and some resource denial. So let me show you what I've chosen. First up is Esper Sentinel. It's a 1-cast 1/1 that says whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. Now, here's the thing. I don't have any ways to buff Esper Sentinel right now, and unless an opponent does it for me, it's most likely going to be that they have to pay 1. But still, in the scenario of this deck where people are kind of struggling to pay for things, it may pan out and I may be able to get to draw a bunch of cards with it. Tithe Taker is a 2-cast 2/1 that says during your turn, spells that your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast, and abilities your opponents activate cost 1 more to activate. Unless they're mana abilities, of course. And then it has Afterlife 1, which doesn't really matter. So the point of this card is to make it so that during your turn, you're more protected and it costs more for them to do things. On top of other things that are going to do it. So it's not just 1, it's going to end up being a lot more than 1. Grand Abolisher is a 2-cast 2/2 that says during your turn, your opponents just can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. And that's not limited to not mana abilities either, like the Tithe Taker. This will affect mana abilities as well. Unsettled Mariner is a 2-cast 2/2 with Changeling, which doesn't really matter. Then it has whenever you or a permanent that you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that spell or ability unless the controller pays 1. See how it's all stacking up to cost more and more to do anything? So this one doesn't count for just on your turn. This is any time. Peacekeeper is a 3-cast 1/1, has an upkeep cost, so every upkeep you have to pay 1 white and 1 of any, or you have to sacrifice it, I think is the new wording on it. And it just says creatures cannot attack at all, which is great for Pillow Fort. Eidolon of Rhetoric is a 3-cast 1/4 that says each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. That's actually going to be important because there is a combo I have in here that I'll show you in a little bit. Archon of Emeria is a 3-cast 2/3 with flying. Same thing as the previous card. It says each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. And then non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. This is really good against any deck that plays a lot of non-basics, especially anything that's above 2 or 3 colors, because they have to do a lot of mana fixing. So a lot of their lands, and I actually say more than 3 colors, because 2 colors, I mean, there's only like 5 or 6 that you really need. But the more non-basics, the better off Archon of Emirium becomes. Fate Spinner is a 3 to cast 1/2 that says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player chooses either their draw step, their main phase, or their combat phase, and the player skips each instance of the chosen step or phase this turn, and it's actually just steps now. So this is great denial of an actual part of a turn. Being able to take away both their first and second main phase is pretty good so that they can't really cast sorceries. Taking away combat means that they can't attack, and with Peacekeeper out, I think that's probably going to be the choice that they're going to choose, but we'll see how that works, and if it needs to be changed, it gets changed. This card is actually the back card of another card. This is Valkmir Protector's Shield. I'm going to show you the front card. Front of the card. I'm never going to use the front. The front of it is Redain, God of the Worthy. You can read what it does. I mean, it works, but it's not what it's in here for. It's in here for the back, so I'll put it back in the sleeve and show you what it does. So it is a 4 to cast legendary artifact that says if a source an opponent controls would deal damage to you or a permanent that you control, you prevent 1 of that damage. And then the second part says whenever you or another permanent that you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that ability unless the controller pays 1. So stacking on more cost to do stuff to you. That's the reason why that's the card. I don't know if I legally in a game can keep it on the backside for other reasons. I don't know. But I am keeping it on that side for now. Windborn Muse is a 4 to cast 2/3 flyer that has an ability that says creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. So Pillow Fort stuff. Baird, Steward of Argive, is a 4 to cast 2/4 that's more Pillow Fort. It has Vigilance, and creatures can't attack you or a Planeswalker you control unless their controller pays 1 for each of those creatures. Again, more Pillow Fort stuff. Magus of the Moat. This may come out just because I have enough of this in here, but you never know. It's a 4 to cast 0/3 that has creatures without flying can't attack. I'd rather just have all creatures not attack, not just ones without flying. Wandering Archaic. If you saw the original budget version of this deck that I did, I believe I have this in there as well. It's a really good card. It's a 5 to cast 4/4 that says whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, they may pay 2, and if they don't, you can copy that spell and you may choose new targets for the copy. This is really good against people who play a lot of targeted removal because they can go ahead and cast it, but if they don't pay the extras plus the 2 for Wandering Archaic, then you get to do it as well. So I kind of liked it. I will never actually choose the backside of this card, so I'm not even going to show you it. Spelltide Enforcer. It's another card that I had in the budget version. This is a really good card for this deck. It is a 5 to cast 3/3 that says whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player sacrifices a permanent unless they pay 1. So now they can either pay the 1 or it hurts them and they have to sacrifice something. So I really like this card a lot in this deck. Jin Kataxis Progress Tyrant. It's a 7 to cast 5/5. Whenever you cast an artifact, an instant, or sorcery spell, you copy that spell and you may choose new targets for the copy, but this ability can only trigger once each turn. And then whenever an opponent casts an artifact, instant, or sorcery themselves, you counter that spell or ability, but you can only do it once a turn. That's actually pretty good denial. Now, remember that this also goes in conjunction with the stuff that limits your opponents being able to only cast 1 spell a turn, because if it's an instant, a sorcery, and artifact, it gets countered, so they can't do anything. But that's not the combo I'm talking about when I told you I'm going to show you later. The last creature is Chancellor of the Annex. This may come out just because of the casting cost. It's 7 to cast for a 5/6 flyer that says you may reveal this card from your opening hand, and if you do, when each opponent casts their first spell for the game, you counter it unless they pay 1, and then it has a static ability when it's on the field of the same thing. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you counter it unless that player pays 1. So again, more stack stuff, more taxation is what this is. Taxing your opponent for doing anything. The instants and sorceries that I chose for my build are actually pretty simple. I've chosen removal, counter magic, and then tutors because they're the best things that you can do in Magic that's not mana ramp or drawing cards. So the removal is pretty simple. It's Swords to Plowshares for creature, Path to Exile for creature, Raven Form for an artifact or creature, and they're all 1 or 2 or whatever to cast. This one foretells for 1. Supreme Verdicts because it can't be countered and it destroys all creatures in case it needs to be done and I'm having a problem and I didn't actually contain my opponents. And then the asshole card of the deck is Armageddon. I'm already taxing everybody heavily, so why not actually just destroy all the lands and make the tax even, harsher for your opponent? So one of the things I want to mention before I move on to the counter spells is that I have a hole in this deck of removal, so I may have to look at that in the future and make some changes, but for now, that's what I went with. Next, I'll show you the counter magic I chose. It's all the cheapest that I could find, not monetarily, but mana-wise. So an Offer You Can't Refuse, it counters a non-creature spell, and then its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. And one of the things I want to mention here is that I wanted to counter non-creature stuff specifically with my counter magic, because I'm not really worried about creatures. I have that covered in all the other stuff I've got. I just didn't have non-creature stuff, like instants and sorceries that are damage-based. Negate, that goes along with the non-creature stuff. Counterspell because, well, it counters anything I want. And this is the Judge's Foil from a long time ago. I am a collector of foil counter magic. I am missing a couple, but I have a playset of these and a couple of the older ones. It's some of the newer stuff that I haven't been able to get. Like this one. Force of Negation counters a non-creature spell. It can be cast for free, and I'm sure you guys know all about that one. And then Force of Will, I'm sure you know about as well. It's one of the chase cards in most of the newer sets. This is one I don't have in foil, but I'm definitely in the market. It lets you counterspell for free by removing a blue card in your hand from the game and paying one. I'm sorry, not paying one. That wouldn't make it free. Paying a life. And tutors. So one of the important things in here is some of the enchantments that are in this deck are really key, but some of the artifacts in here are combo pieces, so Enlightened Tutor is definitely a great inclusion. Idyllic Tutor goes and gets an enchantment, puts it in my hand. Unfortunately, the Enlightened Tutor only puts it on top of my library, so I have to be able to draw it, but there's plenty of draw in this deck. Solve the Equation goes and gets an instant or sorcery and puts it in my hand. And then the last card is not a tutor, it's actually protection. It's actually in the name, it's Teferi's Protection. So I like this card in this deck. It's actually good in every deck, but in this deck especially because if my opponent finally gets something through, I may be able to use this to protect myself from it. So we're going to find out and see. The enchantments I chose from my build are kind of similar to the creatures. They're very pillow forty and staxy. So start off with Ghostly Prison. It says creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature that is attacking you. Remember, there are some creatures that do that as well. And I doubled up with that with Propaganda because it's exactly the same card, only in blue. Sphere of Safety is similar to those two cards. It's 5 to cast. It says creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. So, again, more pillow fort stuff. Rule of Law, and actually the next card is Arcane Laboratory. It's the same card in different colors. 3 to cast. Each player can't play more than one spell each turn, and that's exactly how Arcane Lab reads. And again, I have a combo piece in here that will go in conjunction with them, plus the 2 creatures that I'll show you once I get to the Planeswalkers. Aura of Silence is a 3 to cast enchantment. The wording here has changed. It's not target opponent. It actually says each opponent's artifacts and enchantment spells cost 2 additional to cast. And then you can sacrifice Aura of Silence to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So a little bit of taxation on this. So artifacts and enchantments cost more for your opponent. Karmic Justice, 3 to cast. Whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls actually destroys a non-creature permanent that I control, I may destroy target permanent that opponent controls, and it doesn't actually specify what kind of permanent. It just says target permanent, so you can actually target land on this one, which is kind of dickish if you really want to think about it, but it doesn't actually specify a limitation to what you can destroy. Mystic Remora for card draw, so it's 1 to cast. It has a cumulative upkeep, and I cannot get it back yet. I'm thinking about making some land changes to be able to, but for now, I can't. It says whenever target opponent successfully casts a non-creature spell, I get to draw a card, and that player may pay 4 to counter the effect. I doubt they're going to be able to pay the 4, so if they do cast a non-creature spell, I'll probably be able to draw a card. And you should know what the next card is, just based on what this card is. It's Ristic Study, probably one of the most hated cards in Commander. It's the do you want to pay the 1 card. It's 3 to cast. Whenever a opponent plays a spell of any kind, you may draw a card unless they pay 1. And then the last enchantment I have in here is actually not for Stax, not for any pillow fort. This is actually me testing something out for a win con. It's Luminarch Ascension. It's 2 to cast. It says at the beginning of each opponent's end step, if I didn't lose life, I can put a quest counter on it. And then if it has 4 quest counters on it total, I can pay 2 as many times as I can afford to put a 4/4 Flying Angel out there. The point of this card is people complain about Grand Arbiter decks not having a win con other than people just scooping because they're bored. I was trying to change that a little bit and try to add in some ways to win that would make it so people don't just scoop and hate playing it. Most people do, though. The artifacts I chose are more of the same, Stax and pillow fort stuff, and a little bit of utility. So, Witchbane Orb is my first one. It's 4 to cast, and when it enters the battlefield, destroy all curses attached to you. That's not exactly too important, but it may be depending on what you're facing, so you never know. But it's the second line that gives me hexproof that I have this in here for, because I just don't want people touching me with any spells. I just want to be left alone and do what I'm going to do. So that's why that. If you didn't see the unboxing I did of the Lord of the Rings box set that I got recently, I bought it specifically to get this card to put into this deck. It is the One Ring. It is a 4 to cast legendary artifact that has Indestructible and has, when the One Ring enters the battlefield, if you've cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. So it's a mini Teferi's Protection. It's close. It's not the same, though. It's just for you. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life for each burden counter on the One Ring, and then you can tap it, put a burden counter on it, and then draw a card for each counter on it. So it's a good draw engine. Norn's Annex, it is a 5 to cast artifact. The 5 to cast actually is in Phyrexian mana. Phyrexian mana means that you have to pay whatever the color is, or 2 life. So for this, I can pay 3 generic mana and 4 life, or 2 white and 3 generic mana. It says Creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays a Phyrexian white for each of those creatures. And again, Phyrexian means that they have to pay a white, and if they can't, they have to pay 2 life for them to attack. Me, anyway. All right, God's Pharaoh statue is a 6 to cast legendary artifact that has spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more to cast, so a little bit of Stax. It's a taxation. And then it's not probably going to kill anybody, but it will help. The last line says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses a life. Again, I tried to come up with ways to deal damage to people, so the main win con was not just have your opponent scoop for being bored. Swiftfoot Boots to protect either my commander or any of the creatures on the board that I need to protect with hexproof. Doesn't always necessarily have to go onto your commander, which is the same thing I'm going to say about Helm of the Host, because I understand that having a Helm of the Host out in play and having more of your commander is great, but remember that other creatures in your deck that you build may actually be more important, so you can put it on anything to create copies of them. However, in this deck, more copies of Grand Arbiter basically shut your opponent out from the game because it'll eventually make it so nobody can cast anything but you. The Planeswalkers I've chosen for this deck have a lot of static abilities, so let's go over that. First one up is Dove in Hand of Control. 3 to cast, enters with 5 loyalty, and I think most of these enter with 5 loyalty. The static ability is artifact, instance, and sorcery spells your opponent's control cost 1 more to cast, so more taxation, and I don't really care about the actual loyalty ability, so I'm not even going to read that. Narset, Parter of Veils, 3 to cast, also enters with 5 loyalty. Its static ability is each opponent can't draw more than 1 card a turn, so resource denial. And then the actual ability on Narset, she actually has a great loyalty ability. So for -2, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put one in your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library. This will help you dig for answers or for Stax pieces or pillow fort pieces. So her ability actually works well on top of her static ability. So great for a Stax deck. Teo the Shield Mage, I understand that this is not an often used card, but I like it a lot, and I do use it a lot. 3 to cast, again, enters with 5 loyalty. Gives you hexproof as a static ability. Again, I don't want anybody messing with me. I just want to do what I want to do in this deck. But the actual loyalty ability of creating an 0/3 wall with Defender actually is not bad at early game, so you can save some of those life points. The Wanderer, it's 4 to cast, enters with 5 loyalty again. Prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you and other permanents you control. And the loyalty ability here is actually useful. For -2, exile target creature with power 4 or greater, so now you can prevent some combat damage from coming through. Jace, Unraveler of Secrets, is the combo piece I was mentioning earlier. It's 5 to cast, enters with 5 loyalty. Has 3 different loyalty abilities. You can add 1 to scry 1 and draw a card. Digging for answers is always key. You can take 2 loyalty counters off to return target creature to its owner's hand. Because we are a resource denial style deck, if they actually get something through and then you can return it back to their hand, it's kind of enraging. And then the ultimate is the lock. With all the cards that say that your opponents can only cast, or actually all players can only cast 1 spell a turn, Jace's ultimate emblem is great. It says you get an emblem with whenever an opponent casts their first spell each turn, counter it. So the lock is that they can only cast 1 spell, and then with the emblem from Jace out, it's countered, so they can't do anything. So that's the lock. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, is a 5 to cast Teferi with 4 loyalty. Uptick of 1, you draw a card, and at the beginning of the next end step, you untap 2 lands. So this actually makes me think that I should have, but I won't because I'm not that guy. There is a card called Stasis out there that I want to try, that I have a combo for that I want to try. The other Teferi, the one who slows the sunset, I believe is the name, is a really good option to change out for him for a Stasis deck because it doesn't matter because his ultimate ability says you untap all of your stuff during each other player's turn. However, that's not in here because I'm not that guy. If things turn that way, I will. Moving on to the second loyalty ability says put target non-land permanent into its owner's library 3rd from the top, and then the ultimate is you get an emblem with whenever you draw a card, you exile target permanent and opponent controls. And yes, this can be done on lands because it doesn't specify a non-something permanent, so it doesn't say non-land or non-creature. It just says target permanent. So this could be land destruction as well, which goes great with a Stax deck. And for the final section, I will go over 2 win cons and 2 combos for this deck. The 2 win cons are very stereotypical win cons for a Grand Arbiter deck, so let me show you them first. Azar's Elocutors is a 5 to cast 3/5 that says at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a filibuster counter on it. Then, if there are 5 or more counters on it, you win the game. Pretty simple. However, there is a downside to it. It says whenever a source deals damage to you, doesn't matter if it's your own or somebody else's, a source deals damage to you, you remove a counter from it. So multiple things doing damage. So if you have a lot of people attacking you with multiple creatures, each source that does damage, you take 1 off. So it could be quite hard to get the 5 counters on here, but it's definitely a stereotypical win con for Grand Arbiter. The second one is called Approach of the Second Sun. It is 7 to cast and reads, if Approach of the Second Sun was cast from your hand and you've cast another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win. Otherwise, you put Approach of the Second Sun into its owner's library, 7th from the top, and you gain 7 life. Essentially, you have to cast this twice. One of the cool things, it doesn't have to go through successfully. It says cast, not cast successfully, so keep that in mind. And finally, I have 2 combos in here that are lockdown combos that are in addition to the one I just showed you with the Teferi. So we start off with Drannith Magistrate. It is a 2 to cast 1/3 that says your opponent can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. So keep that in mind. First one that you can do with Drannith Magistrate is Ubamask. It says if a player would draw a card, that player exiles it face up instead, and then each player may play cards they exiled from the game with Ubamask this turn. So this is not a complete lock because they can play cards they already had in their hand, but for the rest of the game, if these 2 are on the board, they cannot play anything further because they won't be drawing cards, they'll be exiling cards. Now, there's also Knowledge Pool, which does similar things to Ubamask. It is 6 to cast, has an ability called Imprint, where it says when it enters the battlefield, each player exiles the top 3 cards of their library. Then, whenever a player casts a spell from their hand, that player exiles it, and if the player does, they may cast another non-land card that was already exiled with Knowledge Pool without paying its mana cost. So, again, it makes it so that you don't play things from your hand, you only play things from exile, and again, that's where Drannith Magistrate stops it because they can't do it. There's another part to this. With Knowledge Pool out, you can also use Lavinia Azorius Renegade. It is a 2 to cast 2/2 that says each opponent cannot cast non-creature spells with a mana value greater than the number of lands they control. That's not the lock. The lock is the second line. It says whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was cast or spent to cast it, you counter the spell. So Knowledge Pool makes it so that they can't play anything from their hand, but they play everything for free that was exiled with it. But because Lavinia is out, all things that are free to cast or no mana was spent to cast it gets countered. If there is anything about these combos that you do not understand, please put a comment in the comment section asking, and I will try to explain it the best as I can in writing.
And there you have it, folks. My not-so-budget-friendly personal Grand Arbiter Augustin IV Stax/Pillow Fort build. This deck fills in the Azorius spot of my 32 deck challenge just nicely, don't you think? I won't pull this build out often, simply because it's not a whole lot of fun to play against, but believe me when I tell you that sometimes you just have to pull this type of deck out to prove a point. This deck is not exactly how I want it just yet, as there are some cards I currently don't own that I wanted to include, but that's what an eventual update video is for, right? As far as next week goes, I'm currently working on 2 new Budget Commander Precon style builds, and I'm hoping I can get them done in time to show you at least one of them. If not, then whatever video I release will be a surprise to both you and I, so be sure to check back next Friday for that. As always, thank you for watching, and
May the Schwartz be with you.